I'm Tony Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy.
Hi, I'm Tony Williams, and welcome to Brooklyn Savvy. We are delighted to have Donna Freitas. Now, you are a visiting associate professor at Delphi University. You're a wonderful author. I have really just admired you and the work that you're doing because it's really making a tremendous difference. But before we get into talking about consent, let me introduce our Savvy panelistas. We have Ellen Salpeter, Phyllis White-Thorne, and Nomiki Makrilos. Thank you, ladies, for joining. So let's talk about consent on a college campus. What does consent mean, and what is it going to look like? Like, what does it mean today, and what is it looking like?
Well, I think that's a really big question. It's a question that's hard to answer. Mm-hmm. I would say one of the things that we've been doing on college campuses and in our culture is trying to educate people around consent by saying consent is about yes and no. It's about the enthusiastic yes, ideally, or it's about saying no, I don't want to do this. And I think one of the problems with that kind of education is we're making it deceptively simple. And I think consent is actually a really tough thing. So I'm more interested in getting to the heart of what consent is. And I think consent actually, a conversation about consent should point us toward who we are as people. Mm-hmm. And I actually think it's a conversation about ethics. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we've been doing, because we want to make things super simple, is where pretending as though consent doesn't have anything to do with sexual ethics, when really it has everything to do with sexual ethics. And I think in our culture, sexual ethics makes us nervous, which is why we're avoiding. What do you mean by
sexual ethics?
Just thinking about what should I be doing? You know, who am I in relation to other people? What is the role of my partners? What do I think about my partners? Do I care about my partners? Do I care at all? And I think for me, you know, last time I was on your show, I was here to talk about hookup culture.
Yes.
And, you know, hookup culture is sort of the dominant culture around sex on college campuses. And one of the features of hookup culture is, or in theory, a hookup is about some sort of sexual intimacy with somebody. And you're supposed to be able to walk away from it as though you don't care about that person and you don't care about the sex. Mm-hmm. And so on a college campus, you have hookup culture, and then you have everybody trying to have conversations about consent. And for me, one of the things that's at the heart about consent is care for your partner and care for sex.
Absolutely.
So if consent is about care of your partner and about sex, and hookup culture is about the antithesis.
Right. How does that?
Then you've got a problem. And so we're talking about one without talking about the other.
Absolutely. I can't agree with you more. You know, so in what I've been reading about college campuses, since there still is a hookup culture, it sounds as though consent means for every act of intimacy, you've got to get agreement from your partner. You know, at least that's kind of what I've been research has said, you know, that do you want to kiss? Yes. Do you want to take it further? Yes. Do you, I'm kind of tied up. I don't know how deep to go with this conversation, but that's what it's kind of looking like, asking for permission, right?
But when you say ethics, it comes back to what you feel is a right way to behave. Mm-hmm. And that would go with a right way to treat your partner, as well as what's right in terms of your behavior, how you're going to feel about yourself afterwards.
And the nature also of the relationship. There has to be a relationship. You know, if we're talking about ethics and an ongoing process, if there's a relationship, then there's an unspoken...
But isn't that the antithesis of hookup culture? I mean, you have to have some engagement, but there doesn't have to be much of a relationship to hook up.
with the hookup culture. I think
Right.
consent.
Well, there should be consent in a hookup culture too, I'm assuming.
Well, of course, of course. I
Right.
think one of the problems is, hookup culture, or just in general, one of the places we've landed on college campuses is a culture of sex where people aren't really worried about communication, or where sex in theory is supposed to be meaningless. You're not supposed to care about it. You're supposed to be casual. Like you're literally
it's a
supposed to be
physical
casual.
act.
But the problem with that is that when then we're also concerned about consent, which isn't at all casual, right? If you're concerned about consent, then you're not going to be casual about the sex you're having, and you're not going to be casual about your partners either. You're going to be worried about their well-being. So I think there's a disconnect there.
Absolutely.
So-
Yeah, there is.
And for us to start
confusing.
here, I thought we were going to end here, but exactly, there is a disconnect, because I think that when it comes to consent on college campuses, alcohol plays a big role in in the hookup culture.
Absolutely.
It plays a big role. So if you have two people that are in some sort of sexual contact and both of them are under the influence, who's responsible? If both people are out of their minds, they're drunk, they're intoxicated, where's the ethics? All that stuff starts to get blurred.
I would say, though, for me, the bigger question is how have we landed in a culture where, for example, taking advantage of someone who is drunk is a good idea? Like, what is it about, or somehow having sex when we're completely unself-aware, when we're not going to remember anything.
Been around
like how,
for a really long time.
Yes,
I don't think that's today's phenomenon.
but I think that we are living in a culture where, seeing someone who's passed out at a party becomes an opportunity for sex.
that's kind of
and I think we have to ask ourselves, how did we get here?
Right, so you're asking societal questions
Yes.
Interesting.
that are not
So
about the
what do you-
individuals. They're
Impulsive.
What do you think?
Kind of
What do you think of
impulsive,
that?
primitive, living in the moment, and kind of not owning any outcomes, not thinking of the next step or the outcome or the residual damage, if I may say, from that. Just living in the moment. I think there's a lot of young people, again, intoxicated, under the influence of drugs, that in that moment are very impulsive and very need-driven and don't think of consequences.
And don't think of how they're coming across to the other person at all.
No.
You're not even
and,
thinking that
and
way.
so an opportunity like that is kind of
But you
taking
really
advantage.
think, though, Miki, obviously it happens. It's what you're reporting on in your books and the college campuses. But
Right.
I think it gets back to that kind of societal moral code center. How you see someone passed out, there should be no way that there's a thought of predation. What you should do is say, hey, are you okay? What can I do for you? As any human being, regardless of anything else, not let me take advantage of someone who's unconscious.
Right.
And so I think that's what I'm hearing you say.
Yes. I think for me, a conversation about consent should point us toward really hard questions about who we are as people.
I
what we
can't
can
agree with
do.
you more on that. Go, what'd you say,
I
Phyllis?
think what we can do, because what I'm hearing, and as you talked about it, it seemed very complicated. So how are these two moral standards living on the college campuses? What does it look like? And my thought being what you said just now, how did we get here and what can we do to somehow mitigate these issues? Because it really does seem a little schizophrenic. It seems crazy.
Well, I was saying a little bit earlier before we started that I feel like we're not having the right conversations about consent in our culture. And I think what I mean by that is because we are also worried, right? We're also worried about rape culture, about the high incidence of sexual assault and sexual harassment in our society in general, but also on college campuses. And so what we're doing is we're looking for quick fixes, and I don't think there's a quick fix, but also institutions are worried about legal implications. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're allowing policies and laws to determine how we educate about consent. So the conversation about consent becomes about avoiding negative consequences. So how can I avoid getting in trouble?
Like raising a teenager.
Well, but how can I avoid getting in trouble, as opposed to how does my attitude toward consent reflect who I am as a person and how I want to be in the world in relation to others? So we're having the how can I make sure I don't break this policy and get in trouble conversation. What do I need to get to make sure I'm allowed to have sex, as opposed to who do I need to be in order to be a good partner in relation to someone?
So this actually sounds as though it's completely values driven.
Yes.
You know, and it's something that if you're not getting it home, perhaps there's a role for the educational institutions to play when it comes to sex education. And part of sex education being that you have to have some self-esteem, some self-worth, some attitude around yourself where that you have certain expectations of a partner. And that has whittled away because of the hookup culture. And it sounds as though this is something that maybe we need to bring back. That when you're in an intimate relationship, it would seem to me that there must be some caring in it, so that you can, in fact, have the kinds of conversations that lead to the healthy outcome. You get what I
I
mean?
agree with that, and I think that it goes
Almost
even
got lost.
It goes further back than school. I think I go back to the home.
They're right in there,
where it
but
starts.
that's
And it's
where
Ellen
starting.
that brought me there, because she said, I'm raising a teenager. And that came to my mind. Yes. So what responsibility do parents have in terms of helping their children to have values that they take into wherever they are, and it helps them to make the right choices for themselves.
And it's a golden rule, but I also think, certainly in my lifetime, I grew up in a culture that there was always the guy that was going to have notches in their belt. I mean, this is not new.
Right.
This is not new.
Absolutely.
And women, I think, were always told to look for, in general, and again, I just think that people want different things from sex, and because of society and the way that they are framed either at home, on television, online. I mean, there's so many things coming at people today about what they should, whether it's in church, there's all these different pathways, and there's so many messages. So who's the successful person? It's the one that, perhaps disrespects people and gets ahead, regardless of gender. And, so you go right back to what is consent. It's about how you value your own worth and how you value the worth of, you're saying partner, but it could be anybody, really how we treat each other. And so this notion of, date rape, all that stuff, it's because of technology is much more discussed. I went to college decades ago, and I was a rape crisis counselor then. Because the issues were there, they just weren't, Twitter feeds.
One of the things I always say when I speak about this stuff to college students is just, I don't think there's any one-size-fits-all approach to sexuality or being a sexual being. I think there's many, many different ways to express who you are and your desires. But I think the problem right now is that young adults are growing up to a culture where they are learning that what is normal is to be casual about sex, period. What is normal is to hook up. And so rather than see, like I did, for example, when I was at Georgetown as a college student, hookup culture existed, but it was kind of like this little town on campus we could go visit, and we could go live there if we wanted, but we didn't have to, it wasn't the only thing we had. And so there were lots of options. I felt you could go on a date, you could do whatever you wanted. So, but I feel like today a lot of students feel like the doorway to all things is via the hookup or via casual sex. And so they don't really feel empowered to choose, I think.
Can I ask a question? Sure. I don't know if your research, and I've forgotten the name of your book, but talked about global hookup culture versus U.S. hookup culture. I'm just curious if this is a uniquely American phenomenon, or is it going on in Istanbul and Paris and,
don't think it's
and
going on in
Cape Town?
certain-
No, I'm
Yeah,
just
right.
saying there are other
Certain
cultures,
cultures that
and part
are
of our
stricter.
culture is macho bro culture, or at least historically, and that may exist elsewhere. And there's Asia, there's all sorts of places where kids are in college.
So I get asked that a lot, and I've spoken. I actually just went to Hong Kong in the spring to talk about some of these things, and but in general, I would say the kind of culture I'm talking about is uniquely American because it's unique to when we're talking about college students, because it's unique to college campus culture in the United States, which tends to be, unless you're at a commuter school, residential. And that really changes things. You're living on campus, and it ratchets up the possibility of partying, how hard you party.
There are residential colleges in many other countries.
Yes, there are, but it's generally, you have a lot of universities in Europe, for example, kids live at home and they commute to campus.
your
And
point
so
is well
it's not,
taken. Yeah.
it's not the norm
Right.
outside of the US, whereas in the US, it's sort of classic college experience.
The 4-year college
Yes,
experience.
involves leaving mom and dad, and so I do think that it ratchets up the stakes. But I want to go back to what you were saying about what parents could be talking to their kids about, because I think about this all the time, because I spend all this time with college students, and they're talking to me about the conversations they wish they had, and I'm trying to get them to think about, think beyond yes and no to what am I doing and why am I doing it? And one of the things that I've been writing a lot about, and then I've talked to parents about, and I've talked to college students about, is I think we need to have more conversations about relationships in general with our kids. And what I mean by that is you all had, your kids have a relational ethic. They already have one, even when they're like 5 or 6.
What they're
But we
seeing.
don't encourage them to articulate it. And what I mean by that is, if you asked your kid, so what is a good friend? Or what is a bad friend?
I ask
They
those
can answer
questions.
those questions.
Right.
And, they know what a good friend is. They know how to be a good friend. They know what it's like to be treated well by their friends. They know when they've been mean. They know when they've been a bad friend. They know when someone has been a bad friend to them. And, that sounds very simplistic, but I feel like in those simple conversations and encouraging your kids to articulate things like that, and then pointing out to them, you know what that is? That's a relational ethic. You have a sense of ethics around relationships. And when you start that conversation young, and your kids grow up thinking about, who am I in relation to others? What does it mean to be a good friend? Then as they get older, it's not a very difficult shift from good friend to good partner, I think, or bad partner, bad friend to bad partner. And I know that sounds very simple, but I do think that some of those basic things we need to do, and we're not doing them.
Do you think that women, and I hear this from young women, they want to have the same freedom as men when it comes to how they approach their sexual partners? That's what I do here, and there's conversations that harken back to Samantha on Sex in the City, because a lot of these girls are now seeing these shows in reruns. And there's this attitude, well, if a man can have multiple partners, why can't I? Why is it different for me? Do you hear that?
Well, so I think in theory, in some ways I feel like women have been sold like a really bad bill of goods. So in the sense that somehow, we've sold the message that having lots of meaningful sex equals sexual freedom and empowerment. And having lots of meaningless sex only equals sexual freedom and empowerment if that is what you really want. But if you're just performing lots of meaningless sex because you've been told that's what freedom is, then you are not sexually empowered. So you're not free. So I'm more interested in, I'm less interested in what does your sex life look like than in do you know what you want from sex? Like, do you know what
Quantity
you
versus quality.
desire?
What does it mean
Well,
to
but
you?
just have you ever asked yourself? So society tells you
questions.
to have
Good
lots of
questions.
meaningless sex. Have you ever asked yourself what you want to be doing? Because I feel like when I talk to college students, they may be having lots of sex. But if you ask them if they enjoyed it, if they know why they were having it, if they know what good sex is, they often can't answer those questions. And for me, that doesn't mean they're free or sexually empowered. It actually means they're disempowered because they don't know who they are or what they want from sex. And I want my students to spend time thinking about good sex, their desires, if they don't know what their desires are, to try to figure out what those desires are. Often, a lot of young adults today learn how to perform sex from porn, but there's a difference between, having sex that you actually want and performing sex you learn from watching pornography. And often the questions I get from students about, am I supposed to do this? Am I supposed to want to do that?
So they're mechanical.
Yes. They're not coming from, ooh, that sounds appealing. Like, I would like to do this. It's more like, oh, aren't women supposed to do X to men? Aren't guys supposed to act this way in sex? And here, when I hear those things, I don't hear freedom and empowerment. I hear disempowerment and lack of sense of self in this.
But they might not be hearing that,
a
though.
lack
You see,
of
that's
self-awareness.
Yeah, but you see, what's interesting is we can see this and hear this, but the person who's actually in that moment, how do you get them out of that moment? Do you know what I mean?
So what have we done as a society to raise children or to bring children along that
They're not going to
have
church. Just kidding.
such a lack of self-awareness and being in touch with themselves, valuing themselves, caring about themselves. You can't care about other people if you don't care about yourself.
Is it that young people were introduced to many things because of this information age in a way where their brains might not even been ready to accept it? You know, I mean, that's what I'm thinking. You know, 'cause well, actually, my son even said that to me. He says, you all didn't always know what was going on the internet. We were way ahead of you on that. You know, people looking at porn 3 o'clock in the morning, their parents didn't know. We didn't know what we were looking at. We were just, so there's a lot of disengagement from where they were because we didn't know where they were.
I think it's also, though, just because our culture is terrified of talking to kids about sex.
I also think terrified of nudity, terrified of bodies.
I'm
You
not
look
terrified to
at
talk to
going
children
back to the
about sex.
international
Well, you're not.
Right.
and there's plenty that's wrong internationally along with sex. But, I lived in France for a number of years as a young person, post-college, but immediately post-college. And you'd see nude billboards and no one looked at it again. There wasn't this puritanical, that's not okay, you can't. Bodies were part of a culture. And I think in this country, certainly when I came of age, your body, you were either a slut or you were, Madonna.
There's not a lot of middle ground there
Madonna
then,
horse
back
syndrome.
then, right.
And I think part of this vacuum that, was filled in with people either feeling empowered or being taught that it was empowering to love your body and to use it as, an instrument in some way, shape, or form. And I actually, listening to you, and I think it's really important to think about what does your sexuality mean? What does it all mean for myself, but also for a partner or multiple partners, depending on where you are in your life and what's important to you. But I think when I listen to you, and on college campus, I can't speak to, but I know plenty of women who are older than college and men who feel like it's not meaningless sex, it means something else. And they're very aware of that. And I think they're in touch with themselves. And it doesn't work for everyone, but it works for them. And I do think they've done some of the work you're talking about when they think of their own sexual practice and relational sex ethics. So I guess I'm kind of in that place where for college, it's one thing. These are young people and they're thinking about how they're ginning up the rest of their lives.
Right.
But I think it's really interesting to think about that because there are people who are polyamorous and there are people who practice different habits than I might or you might. And they do it with a sense of empowerment and awareness and with love and care for both themselves and their partners.
I agree. I absolutely agree that that is possible.
Right.
However, what I'm worried about
Right.
when I talk to college students is
Right.
you're talking about someone who's in a very different place than the
absolutely.
college students
Right.
that I'm talking
Right.
about. And so I actually believe that, for example, casual sex and consensual sex are mutually exclusive. If you're having consensual sex, you're not having casual sex because you're taking a position of concern with your partner.
Right. So it's not-
Period. Like, let's
so
just
your
accept
definition
that.
of casual sex is unconcerned sex.
Unconcerned, uncaring, not concerned with your partner. However, I'll say this again, I don't believe that there's any such thing as one size fits all sexuality.
Right.
What I want the young adults that I talk to engage in is this search for who I am and what I want in relation to this part of my life. I want them to feel free to do that search and to follow wherever it may lead. It may lead to choices that they don't particularly like one day, and then they decide, okay, that's not for me. I'm gonna go this route now. I think it involves experimentation, and so I don't think it can't go to where you were talking about. But what I don't want is to see those college students and those young adults I care so much performing an idea they got from they don't even know where, that has nothing to do with who they are, what they really desire, because they've never even been empowered to ask that question.
Wonderful. Well, I have to say, I think back to the conversation we had maybe 5 years ago to the conversation we're having today. This is fabulous. You're
The
wonderful.
memoir.
Yes, the memoir. We're going to have you back to talk about that. We have to.
That'd be great.
Okay. That's all the time we have for this episode of Brooklyn Savvy.